Welcome my channel. Tonight's story is one of rage, resistance, and a reckoning history tried to bury. Solomon's Revenge takes us to Charleston, where an enslaved man pushed past fear and struck back against those who believed they owned his life. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe, because uncovering true records, cross-checking accounts, and separating myth from documented fact takes serious time and deep research, and your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. Solomon's life in Charleston began the way so many enslaved lives did, without choice, without protection, and without mercy. He was born sometime in the early 1820s, near the Cooper River, his birth recorded not in a family Bible, but in a plantation ledger as a line of property, valued alongside tools and livestock. Charleston at that time was one of the wealthiest slave ports in America, a city built on elegance above ground and cruelty beneath it. Enslaved people were everywhere, in the docks, the kitchens, the workshops. Yet they were meant to be invisible, their suffering absorbed into the rhythm of daily life. From childhood, Solomon learned that survival depended on silence. He was sold twice before the age of 10. The first time, his mother was forced onto a different wagon, her screams cut short by the crack of a whip. Solomon never saw her again. That moment carved something deep inside him, a quiet, burning awareness that nothing in this world was stable. That love could be taken without warning, and that obedience did not guarantee safety. By the time he arrived at the estate of the Whittaker family on the outskirts of Charleston, he had already learned to watch more than he spoke, to listen more than he breathed. The Whittaker plantation was not the worst in Charleston, and that, in some ways, made it more dangerous. There were no constant chains, no daily public whippings. Instead, control came through humiliation, exhaustion, and fear that lingered just below the surface. Solomon worked as a stable hand and later as a coachman, a position that required trust. He cleaned horses, repaired tack, and drove the family through the city streets, sitting upright while pretending not to hear the conversations behind him, discussions of money, politics, and sometimes punishments decided with casual cruelty. He learned the city this way, memorizing streets, alleys, back entrances, and routines. Knowledge became his quiet weapon. By his 20s, Solomon was known as reliable, calm, and intelligent. That reputation protected him, but it also trapped him. He was lent out to other families, forced to labor in unfamiliar households where rules changed without warning. He saw things there that never left him. Enslaved women dragged away in the night, children beaten for crying, men crippled for slowing down. Each injustice layered onto the last, forming a pressure that had nowhere to go. Solomon learned that the system didn't just punish resistance, it punished existence. Religion was often forced upon the enslaved, twisted into a tool of obedience. Solomon attended sermons where preachers spoke of patience and divine reward, while overseers stood watch to ensure the message sank in. But Solomon listened differently. He noticed what was left out, the verses about deliverance, justice, and the fall of tyrants. At night, in whispered conversations in the quarters, he heard older men talk about revolts that failed, runaways who vanished, and masters who died under unfortunate circumstances. These stories weren't encouragements, they were warnings. But to Solomon, they were also proof that masters were not invincible. The city itself fed his awareness. Charleston was full of contradictions, grand houses built on forced labor, polite society thriving beside unspeakable suffering. Solomon drove past auction blocks, where human beings were inspected like animals, then turned corners into neighborhoods where laughter and music floated through open windows. Each trip sharpened his understanding of how deeply injustice was woven into daily life. And each time he returned to the plantation, the contrast made the weight heavier. Violence, when it came, was often sudden and arbitrary. One evening, a young enslaved boy dropped a tray in the Whitaker house. The punishment was swift and brutal. Solomon was forced to hold the boy down while the overseer struck him. The boy screamed Solomon's name, begging him to stop it, to do something. Solomon obeyed, because disobedience would have meant death, but that night he didn't sleep. The sound of that scream stayed with him, echoing in his chest like a drumbeat. Something shifted then. Not rage, rage came later, but clarity. Solomon began to understand that survival alone was not living. Each day he woke knowing he would outlive others simply by being cautious, but he would never be free. The system demanded his silence, his strength, his body, and in return, it offered nothing but the possibility of breathing another day. For many, that was enough. For Solomon, it slowly became unbearable. He started noticing patterns. Which masters drank too much, which overseers cut corners, which knights' guards were careless. He memorized schedules the way other men memorized prayers. This was not rebellion yet. It was preparation. He didn't speak of it, didn't boast or hint. Charleston was full of informants, and trust was dangerous. But inside Solomon, something hardened. The boy who had once learned silence for survival was becoming a man who understood that silence could also be a weapon. By the late 1840s, Charleston was tense. Rumors of uprisings elsewhere circulated quietly. Laws grew harsher. Punishments became more severe. Masters sensed something shifting, even if they couldn't name it. Solomon felt it too, a tightening, like the air before a storm. He knew that whatever his life would become, it would not end quietly. The system that shaped him had also trained him, taught him its weaknesses, its arrogance, its blind spots. Solomon did not yet know exactly how he would strike back, but he knew why. His life in Charleston, marked by loss, control, and relentless injustice, had forged something unbreakable inside him. And when the moment came, it would not be the act of a reckless man, but the result of years spent watching, enduring, and learning the true nature of power. The moment that broke Solomon did not arrive with a single dramatic act of cruelty. It came quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as just another day under bondage. By then, Solomon had learned to endure pain, to swallow anger, to survive by blending into the background. What he had not learned, what no one could teach, was how to live with the slow destruction of dignity. And it was that destruction, repeated one time too many, that finally pushed him past the point of return. It happened during the late summer, when Charleston's heat pressed down like a suffocating hand. The Whitaker household was hosting guests from out of town, wealthy men who spoke casually about land, cotton prices, and human beings as if all were equally owned. Solomon was assigned to serve them, pouring drinks, holding doors, standing silently behind chairs while their laughter filled the room. He had done this countless times before. But that night, one of the guests noticed him in a way Solomon had learned to dread. The man asked questions: where Solomon was from, how old he was, whether he was strong. His tone was light, almost amused, but Solomon felt the familiar tightening in his chest. When Solomon answered calmly, the man laughed and said something that made the room fall briefly quiet, that Solomon looked like someone who would fetch a good price if sold south. The others chuckled. The master did not object. He smiled. That smile mattered. It told Solomon everything. Years of loyalty, of obedience, of quiet competence, none of it protected him. He was still disposable, still currency, still one bad mood or profitable offer away from being torn from everything familiar and sent somewhere worse. The realization hit him not as anger, but as cold clarity. He was not safe. He never had been. Later that same night, Solomon was ordered to accompany an overseer to discipline an enslaved woman accused of stealing food. Solomon knew her. She had a sick child. Everyone did. Hunger was constant, but punishment was selective. The overseer wanted witnesses, a reminder to the others. Solomon was told to hold the lantern. He stood there, forced to illuminate the beating, watching as the woman cried out not in defiance, but apology. The overseer struck harder each time she begged. Something inside Solomon fractured. Not loudly, not visibly. Just a quiet break, like bone under pressure. He realized that the system did not merely allow cruelty. It required participation. It demanded that enslaved people become tools against one another. Survival was not enough anymore. Survival meant complicity. When it was over, the overseer laughed, handed Solomon the lantern, and said, "You're a good one. You understand your place." Those words followed Solomon back to the quarters and stayed with him through the night. Good meant useful. Good meant obedient. Good meant empty. Over the following weeks, things escalated. The master grew harsher, more paranoid. Rumors of resistance elsewhere made him nervous, and nervous masters were dangerous masters. Restrictions tightened. Whippings increased. Solomon noticed that his movements were watched more closely now, his privileges quietly shrinking. The illusion of trust was gone. He was no longer valuable, he was suspect. Then came the final blow. Solomon learned by accident that he was to be sold. Not immediately, but soon. A conversation overheard near the stables, spoken as though he weren't standing 10 feet away. They talked about debts, about timing, about how Solomon's skills would bring in good money. No mention of his years of service. No consideration of his humanity. Just profit. That night, Solomon didn't sleep. He sat outside the quarters, listening to the sounds of the plantation, insects, distant waves, quiet breathing around him. He thought about his mother, sold away without warning. He thought about the boy he had once held down while punishment was carried out. He thought about the woman beaten for trying to feed her child. And he understood something with terrifying clarity. If he did nothing, his life would continue to be shaped by other men's decisions until it ended. If he acted, he would at least choose how that end began. This was not a moment of blind rage. It was a reckoning. Solomon weighed the risks the way a man weighs his last breath. He knew what retaliation meant. He knew the consequences were likely death. But he also knew that silence would destroy him long before a noose ever could. From that point on, every interaction changed. Solomon spoke less, observed more. He moved carefully, storing away details like weapons. Who walked alone at night? Which locks were faulty? Which men underestimated him? The decision had already been made, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The system that had shaped Solomon had also trained him. It had taught him patience, awareness, and endurance. What it had not expected was that those same traits could be turned inward, sharpened, and aimed back at it. The incident that broke the silence did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived as a quiet understanding. That fear could no longer be the thing that ruled his life. From that night forward, Solomon was no longer simply surviving Charleston. He was preparing to confront it. Once Solomon made the decision that he would no longer be carried by events, but would shape them himself, his world narrowed into patterns, timing, and restraint. What he began to plan was not reckless violence, not a desperate outburst meant to satisfy anger for a moment. It was deliberate, patient, and shaped by years of observation. He understood something many masters never did. Power in Charleston did not rest solely on whips or guns. It rested on routine. And routine, once understood, could be broken. Solomon's position as a coachman and stable hand gave him access few enslaved men had. He moved between spaces without drawing suspicion. The house, the yard, the streets of Charleston, the docks. Masters spoke freely around him, convinced his silence meant ignorance. He learned which men drank too much, which guards slept lightly, which overseers were cruel for cruelty's sake, and which were careless. He learned the sounds of the city at night, when carts passed, when patrols changed, when the streets were empty enough that a shout might travel too far. Most importantly, Solomon learned how invisible he truly was. People saw his body but not his mind. That blindness became his greatest advantage. He did not act alone, but neither did he trust easily. Conversations happened in fragments, never fully formed. A glance held too long, a warning disguised as a joke. A question asked twice on different days to see if the answer changed. Solomon understood that talk was dangerous, but silence shared carefully could bind people together. He found two men who listened without asking too much. One who worked the docks and one who labored in a warehouse near the harbor. They shared stories of masters who mistreated them, of punishments carried out quietly, of men who believed themselves untouchable. What Solomon planned was not a riot. Riots were crushed. Rebellions were remembered and punished collectively. What he envisioned was something sharper, something that would strike fear upward instead of downward. A reminder that even those who believed themselves secure could be reached. He began by mapping movements. Which masters returned home alone? Which streets were poorly lit? Which nights the city patrol was stretched thin? Charleston was busy, but it was also predictable. Wealth followed habits. Solomon watched for weeks without acting, letting the plan settle into his bones. He knew that once he crossed the line, there would be no retreat, only momentum. At the same time, he prepared himself internally. Fear did not disappear, but it changed. It became focused. He thought often of the enslaved people who had vanished, men sold away, women silenced, children erased from memory. He told himself that even if he failed, the act itself would matter. That knowledge steadied him. The target was not chosen for symbolism alone. It was chosen for certainty. A man who had inflicted pain casually, who believed his status insulated him from consequence. A man whose disappearance would be noticed, whispered about, feared. Solomon understood that the system relied on the illusion of control. Break that illusion once, and it cracked everywhere. He prepared no written plans, no tangible evidence. Everything lived in memory, paths, times, contingencies. If something went wrong, it would die with him. He avoided unusual behavior, maintained the appearance of obedience. Masters relax when they believe they are safe. Solomon needed them relaxed. On the surface, nothing changed. Beneath it, everything had. Each day he moved through Charleston, knowing he was measuring his life not in years, but in moments remaining before action. He noticed the small things, the smell of the harbor at dawn, the sound of church bells, the weight of silence at night. These details sharpened his resolve. They reminded him of what he stood to lose, and what had already been taken. There was no single night where Solomon announced to himself, "This is it." Instead, the moment arrived naturally, like a door finally opening. Conditions aligned. A routine shifted just enough. An opportunity appeared that would not return. Solomon recognized it instantly, the way a sailor recognizes a change in wind. What he felt then was not triumph, but calm. The plan had reached its final shape. Everything he had endured, the humiliations, the losses, the forced silence, had led to this. He was no longer reacting. He was acting. In that moment, Solomon understood something essential. His plan was not just about revenge. It was about agency. For the first time since his childhood, his fate would not be decided by another man's convenience. Whatever followed, pursuit, punishment, death, would be a response to his choice, not their whim. He stepped forward knowing the system would strike back hard. He accepted that. What he refused to accept was disappearing quietly. Charleston had taught him how cruelty hid behind civility, how violence hid behind order. Now he would return that lesson, not loudly, not wildly, but with precision. Solomon's plan did not seek chaos. It sought impact. And once set in motion, it would change everything, not because it toppled the system, but because it proved something the system desperately needed to deny, that even in chains, a man could still choose when and how to strike back. What followed Solomon's act was not the immediate chaos many would expect, but something far more unsettling for Charleston's ruling class: uncertainty. The city woke to whispers before it woke to facts. A respected master had vanished under circumstances that did not fit the usual explanations. There was no public rebellion to crush, no crowd to punish, no clear enemy to point to. That absence of clarity terrified people far more than open violence ever could. The system depended on knowing where danger lived. This time, danger had moved silently and left no clear trail. Plantation owners and city elites reacted first with denial. Men reassured one another that it must have been an accident, a robbery gone wrong, a drunken misstep near the docks. Anything was easier to accept than the truth they feared. But as hours turned into days, denial collapsed. The body was found, and the reality could no longer be softened. Someone enslaved had struck back, not in panic, not in numbers, but with intent. Charleston's response was swift and ruthless, but also revealing. Patrols doubled overnight. Curfews tightened. Enslaved people were questioned aggressively, punished for hesitation, beaten for silence. Yet the violence felt frantic, unfocused. The authorities did not know who they were hunting. They were striking shadows, hoping fear would flush out a confession. Instead, it hardened resolve and deepened quiet resistance. Solomon understood this phase would come. He had counted on it. Panic makes powerful men careless. In their rush to reassert control, they exposed cracks they had long ignored. Guards abandoned familiar routines. Masters stopped traveling alone. Trusted paths were suddenly avoided. The city's rhythm, once predictable, stumbled. Solomon did not celebrate this openly. He blended deeper into the background, letting others draw attention while he remained what he had always been in their eyes: invisible. The true punishment, however, was not aimed only at him. The system responded collectively, as it always did. Innocent people suffered for his act. Families were separated under suspicion. People were sold south for safety. Solomon carried that weight heavily. He had known this was likely, but knowing does not dull guilt. He questioned himself in silence, replaying the cost. Yet every time doubt threatened to break him, he remembered the alternative: endless submission, endless cruelty, endless deaths that meant nothing to those who caused them. The system punished regardless. His act at least forced it to reveal itself. Rumors spread faster than truth. Enslaved people whispered at night about a man who had dared to strike a master and lived, at least for a time. The details changed with each telling, but the core remained. Fear had shifted direction. That mattered. Even those who condemned the act felt its power. It reminded them that obedience was not natural, not guaranteed. It had to be enforced constantly, violently. Solomon watched all of this unfold without claiming credit. That was essential. A named hero could be hunted, broken, displayed as a warning. An unnamed threat could not. His silence protected others as much as himself. If no one knew for certain who had acted, then no one could betray him, and no one could be forced to. The authorities eventually narrowed their focus, as they always did, toward men who moved between spaces, who had access, who fit their assumptions of danger. Solomon felt the pressure close in. He noticed the questions linger longer when asked. He noticed the way eyes followed him just a second too long. He adjusted his behavior again, becoming smaller, quieter, more deferential. Survival after resistance requires a different kind of discipline than resistance itself. What haunted Solomon most was not fear of capture, but the knowledge that even success was temporary. The system would not collapse because of one act. He never believed it would. What he believed was simpler and more radical, that memory mattered. That fear, once planted upward instead of downward, could not be fully erased. Masters would remember. Overseers would hesitate. The certainty that had once defined their authority would never fully return. In private moments, Solomon reflected on what revenge truly meant. It was not satisfaction. It did not erase scars or return lost loved ones. Revenge, in his understanding, was interruption. It broke the smooth continuation of cruelty. It forced those who inflicted pain casually to confront vulnerability, however briefly. That interruption was his victory. As time passed, the city tried to forget. Official records softened language. Conversations shifted. Charleston resumed its routines, but they were altered now, subtly, permanently. Solomon remained alive within that altered world, carrying a secret that could not be spoken. He knew history would not record his name. He accepted that. His goal had never been recognition. It had been proof. Proof that the enslaved were not passive objects moving through history, but conscious actors navigating impossible constraints. Proof that resistance did not always announce itself with banners and fire. Sometimes it moved quietly, surgically, leaving behind unease instead of applause. Solomon lived with the consequences of his choice every day after. He lived with fear, guilt, and vigilance. But he also lived with something he had never possessed before: ownership of a moment in his own life. One moment that belonged entirely to him. That, more than the act itself, was what the system could never forgive and could never fully undo. The immediate consequences unfolded with a cold precision that revealed how deeply the system feared the truth. Once the reality of what had happened could no longer be denied. The priority was no longer justice or understanding, it was control of the narrative. Charleston's leaders understood something dangerous had occurred, not just a death, but a rupture. An enslaved man had acted with intention, and intention threatened the very foundation of their authority. The first response was speed. Officials moved quickly to define the story before it could define itself. Language mattered. In public statements and whispered briefings, the act was stripped of motive. It was labeled madness, coincidence, criminality without cause. Anything except resistance. To admit motive would be to admit reason, and reason would invite questions they could not afford. Why would a man risk everything? What conditions could produce such resolve? Those questions were more dangerous than the act itself. Enslaved communities felt the consequences immediately. Restrictions tightened overnight. Movement was curtailed. Gatherings were banned under vague justifications of security. Punishments became harsher, not because rules had changed, but because fear had. Overseers were instructed to watch not just actions, but expressions. Silence became suspicious. Hesitation became guilt. The system responded the only way it knew how, by applying pressure everywhere, hoping something would break. At the same time, an effort began to isolate the event. Authorities worked carefully to prevent connections from forming. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking. Testimonies were reshaped before being recorded. Documents were edited, softened, or quietly discarded. If something could not be removed entirely, it was reframed. Dates blurred. Details vanished. Responsibility dissolved into ambiguity. History, they understood, is not just what happens, it is what survives. Solomon watched this erasure in real time. He saw how quickly truth could be bent, how efficiently memory could be managed when power decided what mattered. The name of the man who died was preserved. His status, his property, his place in society were carefully recorded. Solomon's existence, however, became a problem. To name him would be to grant him agency. To grant agency would be to acknowledge a crack in the system's logic. So instead, he was reduced to rumor, to possibility, to unknown. That anonymity was both protection and punishment. It kept him alive, but it also erased him from the story he had shaped. He could not speak, could not correct distortions, could not defend his reasons. Silence became his survival, even as it cost him ownership of the truth. He listened as versions of the story spread that bore little resemblance to reality. Some painted the act as random violence. Others implied outside influence, as if enslaved people could not conceive of resistance on their own. Each version served the same purpose, to make the act meaningless. The city's elites reassured one another that order had been restored. Patrols were praised. Punishments were framed as necessary. Ministers spoke of obedience and divine hierarchy. Public calm slowly returned, but it was a surface calm, thin and brittle. Beneath it lingered a shared awareness that something had slipped through their control. The system had reacted, but reaction was not prevention. They could suppress conversation, but they could not fully erase memory. Among the enslaved, the story traveled differently. It moved quietly, carefully, reshaped to survive. Details were stripped away to protect identities. Names were replaced with symbols. The act became less about revenge and more about possibility. It reminded people that the system was not invincible, only violent. That distinction mattered. Violence requires constant effort. Invincibility does not. Solomon felt the weight of collective punishment deeply. He had expected it. But expectation does not lessen impact. Seeing others suffer because of his choice forced him to confront the limits of individual action within a collective cage. Yet he also recognized the system's cruelty was not new. It had merely revealed itself more openly. The erasure campaign did not protect the innocent. It punished them indiscriminately. That truth clarified something for him. Silence and obedience had never been shields. As weeks passed, official interest faded. New concerns replaced old ones. Attention drifted. That was the final stage of erasure, not denial, not distortion, but forgetting. The city allowed the story to sink beneath newer events, trusting time to do what force could not. Records were closed. Conversations shifted. What could not be eliminated was buried. Solomon survived within that forgetting. He adapted again, returning to the rhythms of enforced normalcy. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. He carried the knowledge that truth does not need witnesses to be real. It only needs to have happened. The effort to erase the truth succeeded in one way and failed in another. It succeeded in keeping Solomon's name out of history books. It failed in restoring certainty. The system learned that control required constant vigilance, and that vigilance revealed weakness. Solomon learned that even erased acts leave residue. Fear, once redirected, does not vanish easily. In the end, the greatest consequence was not death, punishment, or silence. It was disruption. The smooth story Charleston told itself, of order, hierarchy, and natural authority, now carried an invisible footnote. A reminder that beneath enforced obedience lived people capable of choice. That reminder could be hidden, but never fully destroyed. What survived after everything else faded was not a name, a date, or an official record, but an effect. Solomon's revenge did not end with the act itself, and it did not end with the attempt to erase it. It lived on in quieter ways, embedded in behavior, memory, and caution. Charleston never officially acknowledged what had happened, but it adjusted to it. That adjustment was the legacy. Masters spoke differently afterward. Not openly, not in ways that could be quoted or recorded, but in tone and posture. Confidence was replaced by calculation. Trust narrowed. Movements that had once been casual became deliberate. Some stopped traveling alone. Others insisted on escorts even for short distances. The system outwardly projected strength, yet inwardly it began to behave like something fragile, something that understood it could be touched. That shift did not undo slavery, but it altered how power was exercised. Among the enslaved, the legacy moved in whispers and fragments. Solomon's story was never told in full, because telling it in full was dangerous. Instead, it became a pattern, a reminder that resistance did not always look like open revolt. It could be solitary. It could be strategic. It could be silent. That understanding mattered deeply in a world where survival depended on reading risk correctly. Solomon's act became proof that agency could exist even inside extreme constraint, and that proof traveled farther than any single retelling. For younger enslaved people, the story functioned less as inspiration and more as orientation. It taught limits as much as possibilities. It showed that action carried consequences, not just for the actor, but for the community. At the same time, it challenged the lie that obedience was natural or permanent. The system relied on the idea that fear erased choice. Solomon's legacy contradicted that. Choice had never disappeared. It had only been forced underground. White authorities tried to counter this legacy with silence. Silence, however, is never neutral. It creates space for interpretation. By refusing to fully explain what had happened, they allowed uncertainty to linger. That uncertainty made people watch one another more closely. It made overseers question loyalty. It made masters second-guess assumptions. In trying to erase the story, they ensured it remained unresolved, and unresolved stories are the hardest to kill. Solomon himself lived with a legacy he could not claim. He carried it privately, knowing that history would likely never attach his name to his act. That knowledge did not embitter him in the way outsiders might expect. He understood something essential: survival itself was a form of authorship. Each day he lived afterward complicated the system's desire for closure. They wanted an ending, an arrest, a confession, a punishment. His continued existence denied them that satisfaction. Over time, Solomon became careful not to romanticize what he had done. He did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who had reached a boundary and crossed it. That honesty shaped how the legacy was passed on. It was not dressed up as glory. It was carried as warning, possibility, and truth. Those three things together were far more dangerous to the system than any myth. In the years that followed, Charleston experienced other acts of resistance, some larger, some smaller, many unrecorded. They were not caused by Solomon's revenge, but they were informed by it. His act did not start a movement, but it sharpened awareness. It reminded people that control was maintained, not guaranteed. That reminder influenced how risks were taken, how alliances were formed, how silence was used strategically rather than passively. The broader legacy extends beyond Charleston itself. Stories like Solomon's challenge how history is usually framed. They complicate the narrative that resistance must be collective, loud, or victorious to matter. They show that impact can exist without recognition, and that disruption does not require permanence to be real. A single act, even when erased, can alter behavior, memory, and fear in lasting ways. For historians, Solomon's story exists at the edge of documentation, where absence itself becomes evidence. The gaps, the softened language, the sudden tightening of controls, these are traces of something officials did not want remembered. That makes the story valuable not despite its silence, but because of it. It teaches how power manages memory and how memory survives anyway. Today, Solomon's revenge matters because it restores complexity to the past. It refuses the idea that enslaved people were merely acted upon. It insists on recognizing internal lives, calculations, and choices, even when outcomes were constrained. It forces modern audiences to confront the uncomfortable truth that resistance often looked nothing like what later generations want it to look like. It was not always noble, it was not always clean, but it was real. The lasting legacy is not vengeance, and it is not violence, it is interruption. Solomon interrupted the story Charleston told itself about order and control. That interruption echoed forward, subtly but persistently. Even when his name was lost, the disturbance remained. And in systems built on certainty, disturbance is a form of power that never fully fades.